what's incredibly important is that we must recognize this contextual nature of privacy. So this is what I was talking about at the very beginning, before getting into the role of the ethics advisor. And on the next slide, I'll give a little bit more context to that. But just this idea of privacy has very different meanings in these different online contexts. And Twitter and Facebook is a really good example to make that tangible, to make that very clear. That when you are posting tweets, you have a different mentality than when you are posting a photo of you and your boyfriend or girlfriend on Facebook. That photo isn't necessarily for the whole world to see, but a tweet is something that is intended for, well, the whole world or whoever is following you, right, on Twitter. Another insight with an intention to protect people's privacy, this idea of controlling the flow of information, data minimization is a must. So it becomes a duty, a responsibility, an obligation of engineers to only collect the data that they require for their research question or for their research purposes. Yeah? So this idea of data minimization. Consent. Of course, this is incredibly important in the medical domain, but is also, according to the Data Protection Act, is also incredibly important when we're talking about taking data from these online social networking sites. Yeah? But how do you get consent? And you'll see that in some instances, in order to get consent of the individual, you have to break their privacy, which is fascinating because there are certain times where you have data of persons, and you could find out the IP address, or you could find out who that individual is, but in order to do that, you're going to have to send the information to a third party that will put things together, and then the putting things together, you could then contact the person and say, can I use your data to run this experiment that I want to actually do? Whereas if you hadn't sent any of that to the third party, you wouldn't necessarily know who the individual was. You would just have enough bits or pieces of that individual in order to answer your question. So asking for consent is incredibly relevant, but you also have to take into consideration what asking for consent really means. And now this idea that research should be done on a case-by-case basis is really gaining sway these days. So the fact that technologies are constantly changing and are changing so quickly. I mean, cloud computing, the future of the internet has just sort of thrown everything off its course again. So is it possible then to have laws to establish how people should be acting? Is it possible that we stick with duties, or do we have to be more flexible? Do we have to do this on a case-by-case basis and understand what does this method of data collection mean for this context? For this time period, stored in this way and disseminated or shared in this way, versus what does the same method of collection mean in a different context, stored for a different amount of time and disseminated in a different way. Yeah, there's different ethical implications, even just changing one variable. So it's important to understand that it's not easy to make universal rules or duties. We have to do this on a case-by-case basis. So a word on privacy, which I think I can go quickly through because I imagine this is common discourse for you all, but how privacy, this concept of privacy has changed over different eras. So if we think about the printing press era, yeah, individual thoughts didn't need to be shared. Yeah, and the same for prior to the printing press era, when it was just verbal. If you didn't want to share a thought, there wasn't the necessity to share it. Yeah, so there was this very clear concept of the private sphere being, in your mind, in your head, and then you had the opportunity to share it at will if you wanted. Then, when we shift into the area of mass media, this idea of the right to be left alone came into play. And so this was a response to certain movie stars had their pictures published without their consent and didn't want those certain pictures published. You probably all know these stories anyway, but they didn't want these pictures published, and so this idea of the right to be left alone started to become a part of the discourse at this time. Then, once we move into the era of databases, this is again before we have the internet, before we have that kind of interconnectivity, there was still the idea that governments could collect copious amounts of information on you and store them in one place, but they had a very well-rounded picture of the citizen. And what did they need this for? Yeah, that was of course the question. But the idea of privacy was not necessarily this idea of wanting to be left alone at this point. Now we shift into a discussion about having control over information about oneself. Yeah? That you want to control when it's published, how it's published, and to what extent the information is communicated or published, but also stored. So not even this idea of privacy relating to whether or not it's going out or being stored in a governmental database, but really the fact that it's being collected at all sort of minimized our ability to have control over information about ourselves. Now we move into the area to the era of smart environments, right? Where we have the internet that just changes everything, yeah? You have artificial bots on the internet that are creeping and gathering as much information about you as possible. So it's not even now individuals trying to bring together data on you. The human agent has been taken out of the equation in many instances. But now privacy is shown to have this link with identity. And both are emerging within a particular context. So now the discussion on privacy is shifting from one about, I want to have control over my information, or I want to be left alone. Privacy isn't really focused, or the concept of privacy is shifting focus now to look at what it means to create an identity with all of this information online. So some ethicists are talking about the idea of people being reduced to numbers or being reduced to the geolocation. You can see that I have a regular travel pattern of going from my house to the university, and then I take the train to go here and there, and So my identity is expressed through this kind of data in the online medium, in the online world. Or it's expressed by how many likes in a day I click, or the kinds of things that I'm liking, or the content that I'm posting on Twitter, or the content that I'm posting on Facebook. So now, privacy isn't necessarily seen anymore about control, but it's about the relationship that it's sharing with our identity, because it's in the best interest of the government, of marketing, advertising, of companies to create an identity for you based on your online movements. So part of the discussion then has to do with I don't necessarily like the fact that Amazon sends me notices about this really great book that I would love because I bought one self-help book or something, That's not true, even though there's nothing wrong with that, right? But, that is just a very small part of my life. That's not my identity. I'm not an individual who is constantly looking for that kind of material. So do you see what I'm getting at here? Now this link with the creation of our identities, and also this being a nominal thing. And so for the ethics scholars, moral identity is not something that can be reduced to numbers. So how do we balance between this idea of Amazon and Google and Facebook? They have identified me as a certain kind of individual, but I have a narrative, I have a story. I posted that angry message that one day because, it was a certain time of the, you know where I was going with that. So there's this struggle here, right? And when you're so engrossed in this online world, is it possible anymore to step out and see what your identity is outside of this context? Anyway, so the discussion about privacy brings us to Helen Niesenbaum, who is in the United States of America, a computer ethicist, a computer scientist, who talks about the contextual nature of privacy. And now, to introduce it, there are some flaws in the framework that she tries to present, because she says that in order to evaluate privacy in a context, we should first look at what the norms are of that context. What are normal sharing practices for that context? And you can use different environments to compare between. And then you have the problem with a sort of naturalistic fallacy, right? Just because that is the norm doesn't necessarily mean that that's right or the good thing, yeah? So I'm not saying that we should take up Nissenbaum's entire framework, but what she does point out is this very poignant idea of the contextual nature of privacy, that it's important to look from one online context to another and to understand what it means, and to evaluate that as well. To say, you know, privacy is different between Facebook and Twitter, but maybe it shouldn't be. You know, maybe tweets shouldn't be stored in the National Congressional Library. Maybe that's something that doesn't actually need to happen. Who is that benefiting? So that we have the record for dating practices. We can see what our future spouses were tweeting 10 years ago. Maybe we want to know that. Yes, yeah, sorry. Okay, I shouldn't have said that with such a negative undertone. Maybe we want to know that information.